Eli Sutter had once known what it was to be a man of the land, firm rooted and unbending like the cottonwoods near the creek that used to run clear before the drought. In his younger days, he had hands like fence posts and a back that could carry half a barn if needed. Now, those same hands curled like old roots from arthritis, and his back bowed under a weight that was no longer physical. It had been years since anyone had called his name. His voice, too, had grown brittle from disuse, used mostly for murmuring to the animals or muttering to himself on long, empty evenings. The prairie had a way of thinning out not just people, but memories, sanding them down until they were smooth and nearly gone. He didn't even notice the day his voice started sounding like a whisper to the wind. His ranch, once a place of gathering and noise and clatter, had become a museum to solitude. Paint peeled from the barn like sunburned skin, and the porch creaked when no one stepped on it. The windmill had lost its fight long ago, leaving the pump handle rusted and still. His livestock were few, just 3 cows, a mule too old for work, and chickens that clucked more to themselves than for any real purpose. Eli fed them out of habit more than hope. He had sold off most of the good land. What little was left went untended, except for the narrow path he walked from cabin to barn and back again. His wife, Anna, had died 9 winters ago, quietly, the way snow falls in the night. One day she was coughing at the stove, and the next she was a stillness he couldn't wake. Eli buried her under the only flowering tree on the property, a weeping willow that had somehow survived years of drought. He placed a rough stone at her head, chiseled with her initials and nothing more. He didn't know what else to say. After her passing, their son Nathan had stayed around for a time, trying to manage things, trying to make sense of the new silence that had replaced his mother's humming and the clinking of teacups. But Nathan was restless, full of a yearning Eli recognized too late. He'd joined the army soon after, said he needed purpose. He never came back, not alive, anyway. When they brought Nathan's body back wrapped in a flag, polished and folded like a lily, didn't cry. He'd felt the grief lodge in his chest like a bullet that never left, but he didn't show it. The boy had been just 21, no children of his own, no last words, just a trunk full of dusty uniforms and a letter home that arrived too late to be read by anyone but a hollow man with shaking hands. So Eli lived the years after like a man preparing for the end, though he never admitted it. First, he let the fences rot. Then the tractor rusted. Eventually, he stopped writing in his ledger. Neighbors moved away or died off, and the mail stopped coming. The road into town washed out one spring, and no one ever fixed it. He sold his dogs because they required too much attention, too much food, and too much of the tenderness he no longer had. That winter, he began preparing the revolver. He cleaned it, loaded it, then wrapped it in burlap, and placed it beneath the sack of cracked corn in the barn. He didn't want it in the house. He wasn't ready. Not yet, but the signs were there. He had stopped planting. The cattle no longer had names. His meals were cold more often than warm, and the letters he once wrote to his late wife in a tattered journal had stopped altogether. The firewood dwindled, and he no longer gathered more. The man he once was had evaporated under years of drought, heartbreak, and aching silence. He began to speak to the barn not out of madness, but as a ritual. Soon, he'd say to the walls, "Not much longer now," and the barn would reply with groans and soft sighs in the timber, as if in mourning. He would sit at the threshold of the barn with the revolver beside him and stare into the evening haze that stretched over the dry fields like an old quilt. Sometimes he imagined hearing Anna's voice in the wind, or the creak of Nathan's boots on the porch. But he knew those ghosts were just the last scraps of memory, refusing to die. The morning, he decided, would be his last, was bright. Cruelly bright, the kind of clarity the land rarely gave. There were no clouds, and the air smelled of dust and sun-bleached wood. Eli put on his cleanest shirt, a faded blue one Anna used to like, and buttoned it with care. He fed the chickens one last time. He ran his hand over the old mule's flank, letting his palm rest on the warm, living hide for a beat longer than usual. He didn't cry. He hadn't in years. He didn't believe he still could. He walked to the barn and sat down on the stool, near the tack wall, letting his legs stretch out slowly. The revolver, wrapped in its burlap shroud, lay beside him. He opened the sack and unwrapped it, letting the metal glint in the sunbeam that filtered through a crack in the roof. The wind outside moaned gently, and the chickens squawked somewhere behind the barn. Eli took a breath, not deep, but steady, and raised the gun in both hands. That's when he heard it. Not a ghost, not the wind, not memory. The creak of the barn door opening. Slow, tentative, real. He turned, expecting perhaps a neighbor's dog or some vulture come early. But standing in the frame, silhouetted against the morning light, was a small figure. A girl barefoot, hair tangled with dust and wind, a smear of blood on her knee. Her clothes hung loose, ill-fitting. She couldn't have been older than 11. Her eyes were wide but not afraid, just watching him. In her hand, she held a folded piece of paper. Eli stared at her. She didn't say a word, not even a gasp. She looked at the revolver, then at him, and then stepped forward slowly, but without hesitation. She extended the note and pointed to her ears, then shook her head. Eli took the note with trembling fingers. In rough, crooked handwriting, it read, I can't hear. I don't know where my parents are. I saw your chimney smoke. Please don't make me leave. He read it twice. Then again, the letters trembled in his vision. He lowered the gun slowly, resting it on the floor. The girl stood there, unmoving, waiting for a judgment that would shape her entire life. Her silence was not empty. It was a presence, a loudness he couldn't explain. She wasn't begging. She was stating a truth. She had nowhere else to go, and something in her, some instinct or wild hope, had led her here. Eli swallowed the lump rising in his throat and gestured toward the house. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply walked beside him as if she had always belonged there, and for the first time in nearly a decade. Eli Sutter left the revolver behind in the barn. Eli Sutter had lived through droughts, losses, and the slow erasure of everything he once held dear, but nothing stunned him quite like the moment he read that note. The paper in his hand was torn from a school notebook, its edges ragged and smudged with dirt and what looked like ash. The handwriting was unsteady, the kind that came from a child unused to writing long things, but there was no mistaking the clarity of the words. I can't hear. I don't know where my parents are. I saw your chimney smoke. Please don't make me leave. Eli stared at the page for several seconds, then looked back up at her, this tiny, silent stranger whose presence had just pulled him back from the edge of death. She stood still, like she understood how much her arrival had interrupted. There was no begging in her eyes, no dramatics, just a simple need to belong. A need so deep and urgent it had driven her across whatever lonely miles lay between wherever she came from and this worn-out ranch. He didn't speak at first. His throat had gone dry, and for all his thoughts of death, he had no idea how to begin something again, especially something like this. Instead, he held the note gently in one hand and motioned with the other for her to come inside the barn. She hesitated for just a breath, then stepped forward. Her feet were blistered, the skin raw and dark in places where shoes should have been. Eli noticed this and immediately peeled off his flannel overshirt, dropped it over her narrow shoulders. She pulled it tight, eyes still on his face, not in fear but something else, like she was measuring him, trying to understand if he would stay or vanish like the rest. Inside, the barn felt cooler than the blinding prairie sun. Dust swirled in golden shafts of light that broke through the slats in the roof. Eli led her toward the tack bench, sweeping away a pile of tools and handing her a clean rag. She sat slowly, legs pulled up beneath her, the oversized shirt swallowing her frame. Eli rummaged in the feed room, brought out a mason jar of water, and passed it to her. She drank in short gulps, almost nervously, and when she finished, she signed something with her hands, small, slow movements Eli didn't understand. He raised his palms and shook his head gently. I don't know what that means, he said aloud, his voice cracking from disuse. She nodded, not surprised. Then, she reached into the pocket of the overshirt and pulled out a stub of pencil and a folded napkin. She scribbled quickly, thank you. That simple exchange shifted something inside him. For nearly a decade, he'd avoided every kind of interaction. He hadn't written a letter, hadn't gone to church, hadn't taken a visitor into his home. And yet, in less than 5 minutes, this child, deaf, alone, ragged, had cracked the sealed world he'd built. Eli found himself setting aside the revolver almost thoughtlessly, as if it no longer belonged to this day. He beckoned her toward the cabin. She followed without hesitation. Inside, the house smelled like dry wood, old smoke, and the quiet decay of abandonment. It had been years since he used the front room for anything other than sleeping. Dust lay thick on the mantel. The curtains were permanently drawn. The hearth, cold and unused, still held ash from a fire long dead. But as Eli lit the kerosene lamp and filled the kettle, he realized that he was moving with purpose again, not for survival, not out of habit, but because someone else was watching. She sat in the corner chair by the fire, cradling the jar of water. Her eyes darted around the room, absorbing everything. When he handed her a bowl of warmed beans and a crust of bread, she signed something again. Then, seeing his puzzled face, she picked up the pencil once more and scribbled, May. He blinked. Your name. She nodded. May. A name that belonged to blossoms, not dust. To laughter, not silence. Eli whispered it, testing the shape. May. The child gave the faintest smile, more in the eyes than the mouth. It was the first softness she had shown. As the sun dipped below the prairie horizon, Eli sat across from her, bowl untouched. Watching her eat, she didn't rush or hoard the food. She ate carefully, like someone who had been taught manners. Someone who had once lived in a house where things were normal before something had broken. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. Her silence carried the weight of too many stories, and her hands told him more than words ever could. She flinched at sudden noises, the kettle whistling, the screen door slapping in the wind. She jumped when the mule brayed outside. And yet, she never asked for more than what she'd written. A roof, a little food, and not to be sent away. That night, Eli made up a bed on the couch, laying out clean sheets and his late wife's quilt. He hesitated before handing it to her. It smelled of lavender and memory, but something told him Anna wouldn't have minded. May curled up beneath it like she'd done it all her life. She didn't speak, obviously, but she looked at him once, eyes half-lidded with sleep, and gave the tiniest nod. He stood for a while by the doorway, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the stillness that wasn't empty anymore. For so long, the silence had been a weight. Now, it felt like something else, like potential, like a space that might be filled again. The next morning, she was already outside before him. He blinked against the light and saw her sitting on the porch steps, notebook in hand, drawing. Chickens wandered past her bare feet. The mule stood, watched from the paddock, and Eli, still unsure of what he was doing or why, brought her an apple and gestured toward the coop. He didn't expect her to follow, but she did. She watched as he gathered eggs, showed her how to cradle them in her hands without breaking them. Then she did it herself carefully, deliberately, her face a mask of concentration. Afterward, she drew a picture of a chicken with a big smile, and handed it to him. For the first time in nearly 10 years, Eli laughed. It came out rough, like something broken finally working again. It startled him. Startled her too, but she smiled. Later that day, he found her in the barn again, sweeping. She had dragged a broom from the corner and was going at the dust with more determination than skill. He stood there for a moment, watching. Something about it pierced him, this tiny figure in the same barn where he had planned to die. The same barn that had held only loss and ghosts now echoed with the rhythm of her broom and the soft scuff of her bare feet. She cleaned the bench, organized his tools, drew labels for them, and stuck them with nails to the wall. Then she wrote him another note. I can stay out here if you want space. He shook his head, took the note, and wrote beneath it, you can stay wherever you feel safe. She tapped the barn floor. It took him a moment to realize what she meant. Here, the barn, the place she had found him. He walked to the corner where the hay was stacked and began clearing a small space. Brought out an old cot, hung an extra blanket from the rafters for privacy, found a crate she could use for her drawings. When he was done, he turned to her and nodded. She smiled fully for the first time. That evening, she didn't sit on the porch. She sat in the barn, drawing with the last light of day. When he brought her dinner, she handed him a folded note. It read, Do you have kids? He paused, unsure if he should answer. But eventually he wrote, I had a son. He died in a war. She looked at him quietly. Then she wrote, I'm sorry. He nodded. Then, surprising himself, he wrote back, So am I. And that night, instead of the usual emptiness, Eli sat by the fire reading an old newspaper while May drew under lamplight. Outside, the wind blew, but it didn't feel cold anymore. The silence wasn't a curse. It was a bond, a language of its own. By the end of the week, they had created a rhythm. She helped collect eggs. He built her a small desk by the window. She began teaching him basic signs, starting with hello, thank you, and friend. He fumbled, forgot the motions, and she corrected him patiently. He wrote short notes to her every day. She saved them, folded neatly in a tin box he found on the shelf, and he never touched the revolver again. By the time the third week rolled around, something about the ranch had changed. The boards still creaked, the wind still rattled, the windows at night, and the ground remained dry and cracked beneath the hooves of the mule. But there was life again in the sounds that didn't require voices, in the shuffling of bare feet across the porch at dawn, in the scrape of chalk on a board Eli had mounted beside the barn, in the rhythm of shared routine where two people moved together in a silence that had stopped being lonely. May had a way of slipping into the ranch's rhythm without disturbing it. She didn't demand anything. She never asked questions that couldn't be answered, but she was everywhere, sweeping the porch before breakfast, feeding the chickens when Eli's back ached too much to bend, sitting by the fence, sketching birds as they rose in the lavender dusk. Her presence didn't crowd the place. It filled it. Eli had never expected to see his land through someone else's eyes again, yet watching May explore it, he began noticing things he'd stopped seeing. The shine of dew on morning fence wire, the soft bloom of prickly pear at the edge of the gully, the way the mule now brayed in the morning as if to say, she's still here, that little one. She matters. He'd built a small table for her in the kitchen, just 2 planks of cedar nailed into the wall near the window. There she would draw for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes humming very softly, unaware that he could hear. Her deafness had made her cautious, perceptive. She saw shifts in mood faster than any hearing person he'd ever known. When his knees flared up, she brought him the poultice without asking. When he forgot to eat, she'd leave bread beside his tools in the barn. She never scolded or pitied, just acted. Their communication deepened. Each morning, they'd add a new sign to the chalkboard. May would write the word, then teach him the hand motion, repeating it until his old fingers got it right. Home safe, thank you, strong, father. That last one, he hesitated on, when she signed it to him, looking up through the strands of hair that always fell across her cheek. His throat tightened. He didn't correct her, not long after. He built her a little bed frame beside the barn wall, carved her name into the headboard with his pocket knife. She ran her fingers over the letters like she was memorizing them, and he saw her wipe at her. eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. Still, she hadn't told him where she came from, and he hadn't pushed, but something inside him wondered. Sometimes she'd bolt upright in sleep, panting and wide-eyed. Once, she ran to the porch at midnight and crouched low behind the rail until the moon rose. He didn't ask. He just brought her the blanket and sat beside her until she calmed. But he started leaving the lantern burning low in the barn after that, just in case. One afternoon, while he was mending the paddock fence, he heard a clatter behind him and turned to find May sprawled in the dust, a gash bleeding from her palm where she'd tripped carrying a rusted bucket. She didn't cry, just sat there trembling, biting her lip hard enough to break the skin. He rushed to her, knelt, and reached for her hand. She flinched. That was when he saw the marks. Not the fresh cut, the old ones, faint scars, uneven and jagged, some still healing. Rope burns, maybe, belt welts. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. She saw him looking, froze, waited, but Eli didn't speak. Instead, he opened his arms slightly, not a demand, not even an invitation, just a space, a pause. And after a long moment, May leaned into it. Not all the way, but enough. Enough that he wrapped his arms around her without thinking. She didn't sob, just let herself be held. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the porch watching the stars shift above the empty hills, his heart a tangle of questions. Who had hurt her? Where had she come from? Was someone out there still looking for her? And what would he do if they came? By dawn, he had cleaned and loaded the old Winchester. Not because he wanted violence, he was done with that. But he had buried one child. He wouldn't bury another. The next day, May handed him a folded paper, thicker than her usual scraps. A letter, scrawled in her careful print. My mother died when I was 6. She used to say my silence was beautiful. My father thought it was a curse. He said a girl who couldn't scream was useless. He gave me away to a man who wanted a wife. I ran. I walked for days. When I saw your chimney, I asked the sky to let you be kind. You were. Eli stood a long time after reading it, then wrote back beneath her words, "You're not a curse. You're the reason this place lives again." After that, things changed. Not in a dramatic way. No lightning strikes or declarations. But May's fear began to soften. She left her drawings, where he could see them, started braiding the mane of the mule, started leaving extra bread cooling on the sill. She smiled more, sometimes even giggled when the chickens did something stupid. Once she tapped his arm, pointed to her own chest, and signed safe. Eli didn't know how long they'd have, what world waited beyond the prairie. But for the first time in years, he wasn't counting down the days. He was counting them forward, thinking of things to build, seeds to plant, maybe even getting that roof fixed before snow came. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. With her, and the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was sacred. It happened on a Monday, the sky a blank, windless dome, the prairie stretching in every direction like an open hand waiting to receive a blow. Eli was fixing the chicken wire by the barn when the mule stirred nervously and let out a sharp, uneven bray. At first, he didn't think much of it. But then, May came running. She hadn't run in days. Her hands were shaking as she pointed toward his old knees resisted, but his heart didn't. It pounded against his ribs like it hadn't in 20 years. He walked to the fence, lifted the spyglass, and there they were. 3 men on horseback, and one in a buckboard wagon, to clean, to proud in the saddle, and not a single animal loaded for trade. They weren't passing through. They were looking, and Eli knew damn well who they were looking for. May stood beside him now, small and silent, gripping his sleeve. She didn't sign, didn't need to. Her trembling said it all. Eli felt a fire start low in his belly, slow and mean, the kind he thought had long gone cold. He turned inside, he said. She shook her head. Inside, he repeated. Firmer. She still didn't move, so he walked to the porch, loaded his rifle, and set it gently by the door. The same door where she had first appeared, barefoot, shackled, desperate. The same door that had once belonged to silence and dust. Now it belonged to her. As the riders approached, May didn't run. She stood near the well, arms wrapped around herself. Still watching, Eli stepped forward to meet them. The first rider dismounted without a word. He was heavy-set, face half hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, with eyes like boiled stones. The second was younger, with a scar across his lip. The third stayed on his horse, arms crossed. The fourth, the man in the wagon, wore a preacher's collar. But there was nothing holy in the way he looked at May. Afternoon, Eli said, his voice low. Is she here? The preacher asked. Eli didn't answer. She's ours, the scarred man said, nodding toward May. Ran from her keeper 4 weeks ago. Property of Mr. Creel, signed and sealed. She's a child, Eli said. She's a wife, the preacher corrected. May flinched at the word. She ain't deaf when it suits her. The heavyset one muttered. She ain't yours, Eli said. She was given, not taken. The father made the deal. Proper, legal. We got the papers in the wagon. Then burn 'em, Eli said. Scarlip reached for his belt, where a revolver hung low. Eli didn't blink. You want to draw? He said. I'll bury you where you stand. The preacher's eyes narrowed. You really gonna die for a mute? Stray Eli didn't answer. May stepped forward. She moved slow, like the wind had to give her permission. She stepped in front of Eli, right in front of the men, her hands shaking, her legs thin as reeds, but her chin high. She pulled something from her dress pocket, a small square of paper. She held it up, then turned to Eli. She tapped her chest. Once, then signed. Father. Eli's knees nearly buckled. He hadn't cried since his boy died, but now tears burned his eyes. She turned back to the men. Her little hands moved quickly, signing fiercely words Eli couldn't catch, but he knew what they meant. She was telling them, this man is mine. This home is mine. You can't take me. The preacher sneered. You think a girl like that gets to choose? Eli stepped beside her, lifted the rifle, held it level. She already did. The scarred man moved his hand fast, but Eli was faster. The shot rang like thunder. A bird burst from the well roof. Scarlett dropped, his revolver spinning across the dust. The others didn't draw. Not now. Get off my land, Eli growled. The preacher looked between the bleeding man and the old rancher with the calm eyes. He flicked the reins. The wagon turned. The last rider dismounted only long enough to lift the wounded man, then galloped after. They didn't look back. Eli lowered the rifle. His hands shook a little, the kind of tremble that doesn't come from age but from memory, from old instincts coming alive again. May didn't move. Then slowly, she stepped closer. She reached for the rifle and gently, reverently, set it aside. And then she hugged him. Not a lean or a touch or a sideward brush, but a full, fierce, arms-wrapped hug that said everything she hadn't signed. He held her back. I'm not your blood, he whispered. But I'll bury every man that tries to take you. She nodded into his chest, and for the first time, she wept. It wasn't a sound, but he felt it. Her body shook with it. The release of years. The breaking of chains. The finding of home. Days passed. No one returned, and the land grew quiet again. But it wasn't the silence of death or solitude. It was the silence of two people who had found something worth protecting. Eli built her a new room. She painted the door. They planted peach trees. He started calling her May Girl. And when spring came, the ranch bloomed for the first time in years, because he had not died alone, and she had not lived unseen.